Tisha B'Av, a day of weeping, a day to cry. Why are we crying? Says the Gemara, and he says the Pasuk already in Bamidbar. The Meraglim came home, V'tisto kol ha'edo, v'yiten es koilon, v'yivku am b'layla ha'u. Meraglim came on the 8th of Av in the afternoon, told over whatever they told over, and the nation cried that night, the night of Tisha B'Av. Says the Gemara in Tainis on Daf Chok Tes, Omer Rabba, Omer Rabbi Yochanan, Oisoi alayla leil Tisha B'Av oyo. Omer lem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, atem b'chisem b'chiyah shel tchinom, v'ani koveh lechem b'chiyah l'doyos. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, you cried for nothing. B'chiyah shel chinom. And because you cried for nothing, the day of Tisha B'Av will be a day of tears. Gemara is not so clear. What exactly is B'chiyah shel chinom? What exactly does it mean when HaKadosh Baruch Hu uses a language of B'chiyah shel chinom, tears, free tears? The Meraglim came back and the Meraglim told over that the land of Israel was not a good place to go to. The Jewish nation had given their entire resources were being directed towards going into the land of Israel, and all of a sudden they're being told that it's not a good place. So they cried. B'chiyah shel chinom implies that there was no reason for them to cry, and yet they had every right to cry. B'chiyah shel chinom means crying for the wrong reason. B'chiyah shel chinom means the wrong kind of tears. Not that it was wrong to cry, but they cried for the wrong reason. Immediately after the Second World War, after the Holocaust and the displaced persons camps, everybody was trying to deal with the enormity of their losses. Family, friends, everything. Many people were so distraught that they gave up the Yiddishkeit altogether. In one of the camps, there was such a person, he wasn't interested anymore. He felt, Kivayachol, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't care about him during the years of the war, so now he doesn't care about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Everybody tried to speak with him, everybody tried to talk with him, everybody tried to reason with him. He wasn't interested. Finally, somebody convinced him to go and speak to the Klosenberger Rebbe. Klosenberger Rebbe, Tzaddik Nizgav, who'd been through the Holocaust and was in the DP camp. So he went in and he spoke with him, this seemingly completely irreligious Jew. And an hour and a half later, he came out a changed man. The yarmulke was back on his head. He became an integral part of the Jewish life inside of the camp. And his friends couldn't understand what it was that the Rebbe must have told him. How could it be? They tried for days and for weeks to convince him with no success. And the Rebbe spoke to him for 1.5 hours, and all of a sudden everything has changed. So they begged him, to tell them what it was that the Rebbe had said. So he said, I went into the Rebbe and I began to tell him about all the family members that I'd lost. And as I spoke, I started to cry. And the Rebbe turned to me and he said, I also lost everything. Before the war I had a wife, 11 children, and now I have nothing. And with that, he took my hand and he held it so tight, and together we began to cry. And that's how we sat for who knows how long. Crying and holding on to each other. And at some point I realized that I'd purged all the grief from inside of me, because I finally felt that somebody cared about me. They cared about me more than they cared about the fact that I'd given up my Yiddishkeit. And then I finally felt that I could move on. Those were tears, the right kind of tears. Bechir shel chinam is the wrong kind of tears. Klal Yisrael cried on Tisha B'Av, Bechir shel chinam. And for that, we're still crying today. Medrash Tanchuma relates that when Esav came to his father Yitzchak to receive a bracha, and he heard that Yaakov had taken his bracha from him, it says that one tear trickled down from his right eye, another tear trickled down from his left eye, and a third tear began to trickle from his right eye again, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu stopped it from falling. And the Medrash says that the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed through the power of the tear that Esav cried from his right eye. And the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed from the power of the tear that trickled out of his left eye. And if HaKadosh Baruch Hu would have let that third tear fall, the third Beis HaMikdash could never be built. The power of tears. Esav, who is the archetypal Rasha, asked the Steipler in Birkas Peretz, how can it be? Esav HaRasha, how can it be that his tears had an impact on the Beis HaMikdash? How can it be that Esav cried at all? He'd rejected everything that Yitzchak brought into the world. Esav rejected. And explains the Steipler, because finally, once it was taken away, Esav understood its true worth. Esav felt the loss of the bracha so keenly that his tears had an influence in the Olam HaEmes. No human. It's not to be believed, but the tears of Esav HaRasha, they were real tears. Not bechir shel chinam. Tears that can shake the spiritual realms. And the Zohar Kodesh says something terrifying. All the tears that have been shed over the generations in Jewish history were shed because of the tears that Esav cried when the brachas were given to Yaakov. And says the Zohar that until those tears are paid back, it's not possible for the Mashiach to come. Ask the Oyneg Shabbos a question which I'm sure everybody here in this room is asking as well. Klal Yisrael didn't cry enough tears to pay back those 2 tears that Esav cried. Klal Yisrael have cried an ocean of tears over the generations. And explains the Oyneg Shabbos as a concept in the halacha that normally when something falls into something else, if something non-kosher falls into something kosher, if there's enough of the kosher to offset the non-kosher, then the food remains kosher. Normally it requires 60 times the amount of whatever was non-kosher. It's called batel b'shishin. But explains the Oyneg Shabbos as a concept in the halacha of min b'minoi einoi batel. That if something which is non-kosher, which is the same kind of food as the kosher food, mixes together, it can't be negated. Says the Oyneg Shabbos, the tears that Esav cried was over the loss of the physicality, of the Gashmias. He was supposed to be the Kohen. He was supposed to eat the Korbanos. He wasn't paying, he wasn't crying for the lack of spirituality. And says the Oyneg Shabbos, the tears that Klal Yisrael have cried over all the generations are over the lack of the physicality, the loss of the Gashmias that was once our lives that has been taken away. And only when we're able to cry tears that are pure and are directed only around the Gashmias, only around the Ruchnis, only around the spirituality, only then will those tears be counted, to be measured against the tears of Esav. Medrash says the most astonishing thing. Medrash says that after Chum Bayis Rishon, Nebuchadnezzar, the evil, wicked Nebuchadnezzar, told Nebuzaradan not to allow the Jewish people to rest as they went into exile until after they crossed the Na'al Pras, the Euphrates River. Why? Because Nebuchadnezzar knew that if the Jewish people would cry in the land of Israel, their tears could have the koyach, the power, to rescind the edict of the exile. We say it when we eat bread during the week. Before we begin benching, we recite Al Naras Bavo. What do we say? Al Naras Bavo, Sham Yoshavnu, Gam Bachinu. Over there, once we got past the border, only then did we sit down and only then did we cry. Yirmiyahu told Klal Yisrael that if they would have cried one tear in Eretz Yisrael, they could have averted the Golus. And it's the same question, what kind of business is that? For sure, Klal Yisrael cried an ocean of tears before they left Eretz Yisrael on the way into exile. And the only answer can be is that Klal Yisrael cried tears. Bechir shel chinom. They cried over the wrong thing. And subsequently, those tears were not counted. Pure tears have the ability to change the reality down here in the physical world. Rav Aryeh Levine, Tzaddik of Yerushalayim, saw with his own eyes, he related, the mother of Rav Betzalel Zolti, who became the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim, one of the greatest Talmidei Chachomim of his generation. She was an almona, she was a widow, and she would eke out a living by darning socks at night in the light of the street lamps. And she used that money to pay Malamed to sit and learn with her son. And Rav Aryeh Levine said, of course he became a Talmid Chacham. Of course he became a Gadol B'Yisrael, because his Torah learning was irrigated by the hot tears of his mother, the Almona. Those are real tears. Not Bechir shel chinom. It's good to cry, it's right to cry, but we have to cry over the correct thing. Rav Yehuda Assad, one of the Gedolim from Hungary, the 19th century, would get up every night in the middle of the night to recite Tikkun Chatzos. So, weep every night over the destruction of the temple. And he would weep bitter tears. And he would collect those tears in a cup. And when sick people came to him, and when suffering people came to him, he would give them some of his tears as a cure. Such sensitivity. Such a feeling of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'Zeh. So maybe we can't do that every night. Maybe we don't know how to do that every night. But how about once a year? Can we do it once a year? Can we sit and cry over Churban Abayis? It's hard. One of the reasons that it's so hard is because we have no understanding what it means to have a bias. We don't know what the Beis HaMikdash is. It's not something which is peculiar to our generation. Yerushalmi, in Tainus, already tells over that Rabbi Yochanan explained Megillas Eicha in 60 different ways. Rabbi Yehuda Anossi, only explained it in 24 different ways. Ask the Gemara, how can that be? Rabbi Yochanan was greater than Rebbe. Rebbe was Rabban Shel Yisrael. Rebbe lived a generation closer to the Churban than Rabbi Yochanan did. And explained to Mefarshim that was the problem. Because every time that Rebbe sat down to try to understand the depths and explain Megillas Eicha, he began to cry, he couldn't continue. He recognized the loss, recognized the enormity of what was lost. He didn't know how to go on. What about us? we're even more disconnected. We're almost 2,000 years away from Churban Bayis Sheni. Cheskel Abramsky used to say on Tisha B'Av, what are we mourning about? The greatest tragedy of all, that we can't relate to the Churban. The Rebbe Mikotsk, Kedarkei HaKodesh, very sharp, very pithy remark, said that the greatest cry of all is when a person needs to weep and he's unable to do so. That's us. There was an officer in the English Army, Major Tony Holt, who after he retired spent his time taking groups around the First World War battlefields of Europe, and particularly the Somme, which was a place of tremendous, tremendous destruction and death. And he used to tell the groups, we feel proud to be able to cry. We too should be proud to be able to cry. If only we knew what we were crying about. So we need somehow to try to reach an understanding of what the Churban means to every single one of us. Davening, we say Yehi Ratzon to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we say V'sein chalkeinu b'soyasecha. We ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu that He should give us a chelek in His Torah. What are we asking for exactly? Explain the Mefarshim that every person has their own chelek in the Torah. Every person has their own understanding inside of the Torah, something which belongs uniquely to them. But together with the tefillah we say, Yehi Ratzon u'fanecha, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. What's the connection between the two? The answer is very simple. That if the Beis HaMikdash were here, our understanding of Torah would be different. If the Beis HaMikdash was here together with us, our ability to assimilate what the Torah is telling us would be completely different. We would have access to understanding and to depth that we don't have today. Everybody here in this room, I'm sure, has struggled to understand Torah. If we had a Beis HaMikdash, we wouldn't be struggling in the way that we struggle. Just for that, it's worth to cry over the loss and the lack of the Beis HaMikdash and how it impacts on our personal lives. There's an amazing Gra, the Vilna Gaon says, there's a Seder inside of the Gemara, the Amoraim are not allowed to argue with the Tanoim are earlier. Ask the Vilna Gaon, why not? And he explains, because the Tanoim learned Torah when the Beis HaMikdash still existed. Their understanding of the Torah was a completely different quality to our understanding. And it's not shaykh, it's not applicable for somebody to come who doesn't have an equivalent understanding to argue with what they say because they don't understand what it is that they've been told. the Netziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, Rosh Hashiva Yeshivas Volozhin, once revealed that if he didn't cry during the bracha of Ava Rabbah before the Shema, then he wouldn't have any chidushim that day. It's not an inyan of going into shul every morning and saying, now I have to cry. That's bechir shel chinam. It's an inyan of going into shul and understanding within the bracha of Ava Rabbah is the most incredible opportunity to be able to understand Torah in a way that wasn't understood before. And then to cry. I had a Rebbe when I was in yeshiva. It's a bocha many years ago, who told me a Maisa from Rav Shimon Shkop, the great Rosh Hashiva of Grodno, who learned in Volozhin when he was a bocha. My Rebbe, his father learned in Grodno. And Rosh Shimon used to speak about the Netziv. That was his Rosh Hashiva. He used to speak about him all the time, what he learned from him in learning and his chidushim. And he said that the Netziv used to say that the most important lesson that he ever received from the Netziv, from his Rosh Hashiva, was when Rosh Shimon Shkop was a 14-year-old boy learning in the yeshiva. And he was trying his best to understand a Rashbam. And it was late at night, and the Rosh Hashiva came into the Beis HaMedrash to see who was there, and he sees this little Reb Shimon, and he comes over to him to ask him, and Reb Shimon says to him, I don't understand, Rebbe, teach me, explain to me. And the Netziv looked, and he said to him, if you would know how many tears I shed in order to understand that, if you would know how many times I went to the kever, to the grave of Rav Chaim Volozhiner to beseech him to help me to understand, you wouldn't ask me just to tell you what it means. And he didn't explain it to him. And Rosh Shimon Shkop told my Rebbe's father that that was the biggest lesson that he ever learned. To cry tears, to understand Torah, to cry tears, to know that if the Beis HaMikdash was with us, our Torah understanding would be infinitely different from the way that it is now. Those are real tears. Not bechir shel chinam. Those are the real thing. I saw the most beautiful story not very long ago. Yeshivas Ponovich was established by Rav Yosef Shalom Kahanaman. All of you know it today as that beautiful building on the mountain where Ponovich, the hill where Ponovich is built in Bnei Brak. They didn't start off over there. They started off elsewhere, in Bnei Brak, and 2 weeks after the yeshiva began with a very limited amount of bochrim, the Ponovich Rav came and asked the boys to eat lunch quickly because they were going to have a cornerstone laying ceremony on the hill where Ponovich stands today. So they ate quickly and off they went, off to that hill. And the Chazon Ish was there. And they started to recite Tehillim before the ceremony. And everybody was reciting Tehillim except for the Ponovich Rav. The Ponovich Rav was crying so hard, he couldn't get a word out of his mouth. And the Chazon Ish told him, Ponovich Rav, vain, you should cry. Torah is built with tears. And after they finished reciting Tehillim, they invited the Chazon Ish to come and pour the cement. And he lifted up a shovel that was full of cement, and he burst into tears, the Chazon Ish. And his tears flowed from his face into the cement, and from there into the hole that was going to become the foundations of Yeshivas Ponevezh. If anyone had any doubts up until now how it was that Yeshivas Ponevezh became the magnificent edifice that it is today, now you know. Because it's built on real tears, not bechiyah shochinam. The Gemara in Taanis says, Kol hamisabel al Yerushalayim zoiche v'roy b'simchoso. Anybody who cries over Yerushalayim, anyone who mourns over Yerushalayim, zoiche v'roy b'simchoso, will see its joy. The Beis Hamikdash wasn't a place just of korbanos. The Beis Hamikdash, the temple, was a place of Chaim Shleimim, Chaim Shel Rachmim, Chaim Shel Oishev, Shel Nachas. That's what we're crying for. A loss of all those things. Of course we're crying for the lack of the Shekhinah, but what does that mean? Chaim Shel Shleimus. Chaim of completeness. Chom Beis Hamikdash is Midas Hadin. That's not what we want. We want clarity. Clarity to understand the Torah HaKadoshah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us. Clarity in the choices that we make throughout our lives. We have no clarity, and for that we should be misabel. For that we should mourn. Mourning over Yerushalayim, mourning over the lack of the Beis Hamikdash is something which is easier to do now, because if we mourn and we cry real tears, there'll be no more hester upon him. HaKadosh Baruch Hu won't hide himself from us anymore. That's what we're mourning from. There's a very famous Gemara at the end of Makos. Tells over a story that took place. Kevan she'egiya lahar habayis. A group of rabbis came to Har HaBayis right after the Churban. Ro show mi beis kodshei hakdoshim. They saw a fox wandering around in what was the Holy of Holies. Ischilu hein boichin. They started to cry. Rabbi Akiva Matzachek. Rabbi Akiva laughed. Amuloi, they said to him, Mipnei mata matzachek. What are you laughing about? As Omar lehem, he said to them, Mipnei matem boichim. Why are you crying? Amuloi, mokum shekosav boy v'azai krov yumas. The place where it says that if a strange person goes in, a non-Kohen goes in, he'll die. V'achshav shulim holchu boy v'lo nivkeh. And now there are foxes wandering around there, and we shouldn't cry. Omar lehen, he said to them, lekach ani metachek. That's exactly why I'm crying. B'ur yeksiv, the Navi says, lechein biglalchen Tzion sodeh techrash. The Tzion Yerushalayim will be plowed over. It will be destroyed. But in Zachariah it says, Oid yeshvu zkenim uzkenois b'rechoivos Yerushalayim, that there'll come a time when there'll be elderly people sitting in the streets of Yerushalayim in peace. And said Rabbi Akiva to his chaverim, Ad sheloi niskayma nevuosoi shel Uriah, until I didn't see with my own eyes that Uriah's prophecy came true of Yerushalayim being plowed over. I was concerned. Maybe the nevuah of Zechariah won't come to fruition either. But now that we've seen Yerushalayim plowed over and we've seen the destruction of the temple, now we know that the nevuah of Zechariah will also come to fruition. They said to him, Akiva nechamtanu, you have consoled us. It's a very poignant Gemara. It's a very beautiful Gemara. Ask the Maharal. What did he tell them that they didn't know already? They're perfectly aware of the nevuah of Uriah. They're perfectly aware of the fact that the temple will be destroyed. And they're perfectly aware of the fact that Zechariah said that one day, in Mirz Hashem, Zkenim and Zkenois will sit B'Rechovois Yerushalayim. Ask the Maharal, surely the Gemara is not suggesting that Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Yeshua, who were the Chaverim together with Rabbi Akiva, surely the Gemara is not suggesting that they didn't know something as basic as that. Says the Maharal, most beautiful of Pshat. When Rabbi Akiva saw the extent of the Churban, when Rabbi Akiva saw how enormous, how all-encompassing the Churban was, so he finally understood how enormous, how all-encompassing the Geula will be. And that's why he laughed. We too have to understand that with the Churbanos of Klal Yisrael over the generations, with the enormity of the Churbans one after the other from the Batei Mikdash onwards, the enormity of each Churban is simply a reflection of the enormity of how great the Simcha will be when the Mashiach comes. We need to find Simcha. We need to recognize inside of ourselves that we have to live b'simcha. It took me a long time to understand something, but now I do, Baruch Hashem. Gemara in Tainis, the very famous phrase, Daf Chof Tes, Keshem shenichnas ov mimatim b'simcha, kach mi shenichnas odo ma'abim b'simcha. Everybody knows the last part of the Gemara because that's what everybody says when Adar, the month of Adar, that has Purim inside of it, everyone says, Misha nichnas Adar ma'abim b'simcha. But if the emphasis is being placed on being ma'abim b'simcha, then this Maimer of Chazal should have appeared in the Gemara Megillah, not in Tainus. Why does it appear in Tainus? Because the Chiddush is clear. You don't have to be told to be ma'abim b'simcha in Adar. It's a simcha dikamon. Kishem shenichnas Av mimatim b'simcha. We have to know that even in Av we have to be b'simcha, but we have to dampen our simcha. Not to imagine that Av is a simcha-less month, a month that's devoid of joy. As Shimon Schwab explains, we always have to be b'simcha. Simcha is like the flame underneath a pot of hot water. When you want the water to boil, you turn up the flame and it bubbles. When you want the water to be less hot, you turn down the flame, but you don't switch it off. If you switch it off, you have to start the process all over again. And there Shimon Schwab had the most beautiful idea. He says that the Pasuk says, "Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha." The simple pshat is that we have to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'simcha. But Rav Schwab explained, if du es Hashem b'simcha, even when it's an avodah, even when we don't feel like it, even when it's hard for us, even when we're going through hard times, we have to be b'simcha. The Gemara in Pesachim says, She'ein ha'shchina shora, the Shechina doesn't come down to us, doesn't reside with us. Lo mitoich atzlus, lo mitoich atzvus, lo mitoich schoik, v'lo mitoich kalas roish, v'lo mitoich devorim b'teilim. How can we draw the Shechina down to us? Ela mitoich dava simcha shel mitzvah. To be involved in mitzvahs. Even today on Tisha B'Av, we're involved in mitzvahs. And for that, we have to have a certain dimension of simcha. Perhaps the most famous phrase of Rabbi Nachman Mibreslev is mitzvah gedola liyos b'simcha tomid. That we should always be b'simcha. The greatest simcha of all is, the greatest mitzvah of all is to be b'simcha. Rav Shach used to switch the words around. And he used to say, simcha gdola liyos b'mitzvah tamid. The greatest simcha is to be involved in mitzvahs. They're not contradicting each other. They're complementing each other. Rabbi Nachman is teaching us to be b'simcha. Rav Shach is teaching us that to be b'simcha means to be involved in mitzvahs. Gemara tells over a story of Yosef Meshiso. Terrible, tragic story. A traitor to the Jewish nation who brought the Romans into Yerushalayim, to the Beis Hamikdash. And when they arrived at the Beis Hamikdash, the Romans, wanting to thank Yosef Meshiso, they told him that you can go in and you can bring out whatever you want. You can keep it. And he went into the Beis Hamikdash and he came out dragging the golden menorah. And the Romans told him, you have no sense, you don't understand that that's too much for you. I guess when they said he can take out anything, they didn't really mean it. They said, go back in and bring out something that's more on your size, more for your kind of a standard. And Yosef Meshiso refused to go. And they threatened him, and they ordered him. And Yosef Meshiso, in the Medrash in Bereshis Rabbah, it says, it's not enough that I angered my Creator when I went in the first time. He says, to go in a second time, I can't do it. And in the end, the Romans murdered Yosef Meshiso with the most terrible, terrible form of death because he wouldn't do what they wanted him to do. Ask the Panovich Yosef Meshiso was a Rasha Marusha. He went into the Beis Hamikdash and he brought out a golden menorah. What stopped him from going back in again? What was the big deal? Why couldn't he just go back in and take whatever else he wanted to take out? And answers the Panovich that it's inconceivable that somebody who goes into the Kodesh, someone who goes into a holy place, would come out unchanged. We're also in a holy place. Not just this Mokum Kodesh Hazeh, but Yerushalayim. We've also moved into a place of Kedusha. It's inconceivable that after this Tisha B'Av we should come out unchanged from the way that we went in. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky heard a story of a Russian who managed to escape from communist Russia, who knew nothing about Yiddishkeit, nothing, except for one pasuk. So if I were to ask you which pasuk did he know, we would all say that he must have known the Shema. He didn't know the Shema. He wasn't familiar with it. He knew the pasuk, Tachas asher lo yavaretes Hashem Elokecha besimcha v'tuv leivov. That the curses will come across the Jewish people, will come upon the Jewish people because we don't serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu besimcha. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky was intrigued. How could it be? He asked somebody to bring this Russian Jew to him. And he told over the most astonishing story. He says, I know nothing about Yiddishkeit and I know nothing about the Torah, but that verse in the Torah I must have heard 1,000 times. He said they were in the work camps next to Warsaw during the war. And the jobs that the Nazis gave them were to roll enormous rocks up a hill and then down the hill. On the other side. I don't think there was any point to what they were doing. And he told Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky there was an old Jew next to him. And on the way up pushing these rocks, he would say, Zalman es kommt dir. It's coming to you. Tachas asher lo yavaretes Hashem Elokecha besimcha v'tuv leivov. And this Jew from Russia said every day he heard the same refrain over and over and over again. And Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky wanted to know who was this Jew? Who was this Zalman? And he started to look around and it transpired that it was the Kloisenberger Rebbe. The Kloisenberger Rebbe who went through Yisurim, the Baruch Hashem we can't even begin to relate to. And yet he understood that somehow inside of his tzidkus, inside of the way that he measures the world, Tachas asher lo yavaretes Hashem Elokecha besimcha v'tuv leivov. The Kotzker Rebbe says that the Churban is that of a loving father to a son. That's a source of the Nechama. Like Shabbos in Mitzvah Hashem is Shabbos Nachamu. What's happened so soon from Tisha B'Av is that we understand that HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought his anger down on the Beis HaMikdash. And we're still here to tell the tale. And that, says the Kotzker Rebbe, is why the month of Av is called Menachem Av. Because the real source of Nechama, the real source of Nechama is knowing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is watching over the Jewish nation. Amar Rebbe Elazar, says the Gemara in Brachos. Miyom shecharav Beis HaMikdash ninalu shari tefillah. From the time of the Churban, the gates of tefillah have been closed, they've been locked. Afal pi sheshari tefillah ninalu, shari dimo loy ninalu. The only gates that are left open the whole time are the gates of tears. Yirmiyah, a Navi says, V'terdeno einenu dimo, v'apapenu yiznu mayim, let our eyes run with tears and our pupils flow with water. We have to learn how to cry. We have to learn what to cry about. Not to cry b'chir shel chinam. Not to cry for the wrong reasons. Not to waste our tears. And then together, Be'ez Hashem, we'll be zoiche to greet the Mashiach here in Yerushalayim and to be mekuyim the words of David HaMelech, Oz Yimoles Choikpinu, then our mouths will truly be filled with laughter. Amen. Amen.